Hello everyone, and welcome back to Noir by Night. I'm thrilled you've decided to join me for another deep dive into the shadows of human nature. Today's story is one that will take us through the twisted corridors of obsession, revenge, and the terrifying lengths some will go to create their perfect world. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Let me know where you're listening from around the world, and when we're done, tell me what your favorite part of this story was. Your engagement means everything to me, so please don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoy today's tale, and subscribe for more dark stories that will keep you awake at night. Now, settle in somewhere comfortable, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for a story that begins in the quiet suburbs of Connecticut, but descends into something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Detective Sarah Chen had seen her share of crime scenes, but there was something unsettling about perfection that made her skin crawl. Maple Ridge Subdivision looked like it had been torn from the pages of a home and garden magazine. Every lawn was precisely manicured, every driveway swept clean, every house painted in approved earth tones that complemented the carefully planned landscape. It was Tuesday morning, October 15th, when the first call came in. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, 73 years old, had been found dead in her kitchen by her daughter who'd come for their weekly coffee date. What made it unusual wasn't the death itself. Elderly people died all the time, but the circumstances surrounding it. Sarah pulled her sedan up to 1247 Birchwood Lane, noting how even the police vehicles seemed to disturb the aesthetic harmony of the street. Officer Martinez met her at the front door, his usually steady hands shaking slightly as he handed her the preliminary report. "What have we got, Martinez?" Sarah asked, pulling on her latex gloves. "Elderly woman appears to be a natural. 'Cause at first glance, but..." Martinez paused, running his hand through his hair. "Detective, you need to see this for yourself." Sarah followed him through the immaculate foyer, past family photos arranged with mathematical precision, into a kitchen that belonged in a showroom. Everything was spotless, from the granite countertops to the stainless steel appliances. Eleanor Hartwell sat slumped over her breakfast table, wearing a pale blue cardigan and pearls, as if she'd been dressed for company. "Medical examiner's initial assessment?" Sarah asked, circling the body. "Heart attack, most likely. But look at this." Martinez pointed to the breakfast setting. A single place mat, perfectly aligned with the table's edge. A cup of tea, still warm, positioned exactly in the center of a saucer. A piece of toast cut into 4 precise triangles, each bite taken with mechanical regularity. Sarah knelt beside the body, studying Eleanor's face. The woman's expression was peaceful, almost serene, but something nagged at Sarah's instincts. In 20 years of police work, she'd learned to trust that feeling. "Where's the daughter now?" "Living room. Rebecca Hartwell, 48, works as an accountant downtown. She's pretty shaken up." Sarah found Rebecca sitting on the edge of a cream-colored sofa, tissues crumpled in her hands, mascara streaking down her cheeks. The living room continued the theme of oppressive perfection. Every throw pillow positioned just so, every book on the shelves arranged by height. "I'm Detective Chen. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Hartwell." "It's Ms. Hartwell," Rebecca corrected automatically. "I never married. Mother always said it was better to wait for the right person than settle for someone who couldn't appreciate. Order. Can you tell me about this morning?" Rebecca dabbed at her eyes. "I come every Tuesday at 9:30. Mother insisted on punctuality. She said chaos was the enemy of a meaningful life. When I arrived, The front door was unlocked, which was unusual. Mother never left doors unlocked. I found her just as you saw her. Sarah made notes, observing Rebecca's fidgeting with the tissue. Did your mother have any health problems? High blood pressure, some arthritis, but nothing serious. She took her medications religiously, exercised every morning at 6-8, the same breakfast every day for 30 years. Rebecca's voice grew smaller. She said routine was the foundation of happiness. What about friends, neighbors, anyone? Who might have visited recently? Mother wasn't social. She said most people were too disorganized to be good company. The only person she ever spoke to regularly was Mr. Thornfield, the man who designed this subdivision. He would visit sometimes, to check on how the community was developing. Sarah's pen stopped moving. Mr. Thornfield, David Thornfield. He's an architect, very particular about maintaining the standards of Maple Ridge. Mother admired his vision for ordered living. After taking Rebecca's contact information and ensuring she had someone to stay with, Sarah walked back through the house. The perfection felt suffocating now, like a museum exhibit of how life should be lived rather than how it was actually lived. She paused at Eleanor's bedroom door, noting the military precision with which everything was arranged. The bed was made with hospital corners, clothes hung in the closet organized by color and season. On the nightstand sat a single framed photograph of a younger Eleanor standing next to a tall man with silver hair and intense eyes. They were positioned in front of an architectural rendering of Maple Ridge, both smiling with the satisfaction of a shared vision. Sarah picked up the frame, studying the man's face. Something about his smile didn't reach his eyes, giving him an unsettling quality that made her think of predators in nature documentaries. Patient and calculating. Her phone buzzed. Martinez's voice crackled through the speaker. Detective, we just got another call. 1156 Oakwood Drive, that's 3 streets over. Another elderly resident, found dead this morning under similar circumstances. Sarah felt the familiar chill that came with recognizing a pattern. 2 deaths in one morning, both elderly, both in the same subdivision, both surrounded by the same oppressive perfection. I'll be right there, she said, taking a photo of the framed picture with her phone. As she drove through the winding streets of Maple Ridge, Sarah noticed things she'd missed on her first pass. Every house was set back from the street at exactly the same distance. Every mailbox was identical. Even the trees appeared to have been planted according to some master plan, creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight in precisely calculated patterns. It was beautiful, she had to admit. But beauty this controlled, this rigid, felt unnatural. It made her think of David Thornfield's smile in the photograph. Perfect on the surface, but hiding something darker underneath. 1156 Oakwood Drive. Belonged to Harold Pemberton, 81 years old, retired mathematics professor. Unlike Eleanor's pristine kitchen scene, Harold had been found in his study, slumped over a chessboard with a game in progress. But like Eleanor, everything around him was arranged with mathematical precision. Sarah arrived to find the same unsettling perfection. Harold sat in a leather chair that had been positioned at exactly the right angle to catch the morning light. His reading glasses were folded neatly beside the chessboard, and a cup of coffee had been placed on a coaster precisely aligned with the corner of his desk. Dr. Patricia Wells, the medical examiner, was already on scene. Sarah had worked with Patricia for 8 years and had never seen her look quite so perplexed. "What's your initial assessment?" Sarah asked. "Stroke, most likely. Classic presentation for a man his age. Patricia removed her gloves, but her expression remained troubled. But there's something odd about the positioning. Look at how he's sitting. Sarah studied Harold's posture. His hands were folded in his lap, his back straight against the chair, his head tilted at what appeared to be a calculated angle. It looked more like a portrait than the way someone would naturally slump after a stroke. Could someone have moved him after death? Possible, but why? And look at this chess game. Patricia pointed to the board. He was playing white, and according to the position, he was about to win in 3 moves. But the final move was never made. Sarah photographed the chessboard, noting the precise arrangement of pieces. Who found him? Cleaning lady, Maria Santos. She comes every Tuesday at 10:30. Door was unlocked, just like at the Hartwell house. Maria Santos sat in Harold's living room, wringing her hands. She was a small woman in her 50s, with worried eyes and calloused fingers that spoke of years of hard work. Mr. Harold, he was a very particular man, Maria explained in accented English. Everything had to be just so. He would check my work with ruler sometimes, make sure furniture was exact distance from walls. Did he mention feeling ill recently? No. He was a healthy man for his age. Every morning he would do exercises, eat the same breakfast, and work on chess problems. Very routine, very organized. Maria's voice dropped to a whisper. But in the last few weeks, he seems different. More nervous, like he was waiting for something. Waiting for what? I don't know. But he would look out the window a lot, check locks many times, and he asks me strange questions. Sarah leaned forward. What kind of questions? He asked if I ever felt like someone was watching me, if I notice anything different about the neighborhood. He says sometimes people pretend to be helpful, but they have other reasons. Sarah felt the familiar tingle of a lead developing. Did he mention anyone specific? Maria nodded slowly. He mentioned the architect, Mr. Thornfield. Say he was coming around too much, asking too many questions about how people live in their houses. The second mention of David Thornfield in one morning couldn't be coincidence. Sarah made a note to research the architect as soon as she returned to the station. After finishing at Harold's house, Sarah drove slowly through Maple Ridge, really, looking at the subdivision for the first time. What she saw made her increasingly uncomfortable. The perfection wasn't just aesthetic, it was systematic. Street signs were positioned at identical heights. House numbers followed a pattern that went beyond simple sequential numbering. Even the garbage cans, visible on this collection day, were arranged with military precision. She pulled over and called her partner, Detective Mike Rodriguez, who was following up on background checks. Mike, what did you find on our 2 victims? Interesting. Coincidences. Both moved to Maple Ridge within the last 5 years. Both were widowed, living alone, very routine-oriented lifestyles, and both had recent contact with the subdivision's developer, David Thornfield. What kind of contact? According to neighbors I spoke with, Thornfield has been making regular visits to longtime residents, supposedly conducting satisfaction surveys about community living. But here's the weird part, Sarah. He only visits people who live alone. Sarah felt pieces clicking into place. What do we know about Thornfield himself? That's where it gets interesting. David Thornfield, 54 years old, licensed architect, designed and developed Maple Ridge starting in 2018. But before that, there's almost no record of him. No previous architectural projects, no employment history, like he appeared out of nowhere with enough capital to develop a multi-million-dollar subdivision. That's impossible in today's world. That's what I thought. I'm running deeper background checks now. But Sarah, there's something else. I talked to the county planning office. Maple Ridge was approved with unusual speed, and several code requirements were mysteriously waived during construction. Sarah started her car, a plan forming in her mind. I'm going to pay Mr. Thornfield a visit. What's his address? That's the thing. He doesn't live in Maple Ridge. His address is listed as 2847 Mountain View Road, about 10 miles north of the subdivision. But Sarah, be careful. Something about this whole situation feels wrong. Mountain View Road wound through dense forest, before opening onto a clearing where a modern glass and steel house perched on the edge of a cliff. The architecture was striking, all clean lines and geometric precision, but it felt cold and unwelcoming against the natural landscape. Sarah parked in the circular driveway and studied the house. Unlike the warm earth tones of Maple Ridge, this structure was built from steel, glass, and concrete. It looked more like an observation post than a home. She pressed the doorbell and heard footsteps approaching. The door opened to reveal a tall man with silver hair and intense grey eyes. Sarah recognized him immediately from Eleanor's photograph. Mr. Thornfield, I'm Detective Chen, Connecticut State Police. I'd like to ask you a few questions about the Maple Ridge subdivision. David Thornfield's smile was perfect, but like in the photograph, it didn't reach his eyes. Of course, Detective. Please, come in. I always have time to discuss my life's work. He led her into a living room that felt like an architectural showroom. Every piece of furniture appeared to have been selected for its geometric properties. Rather than comfort, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the valley below, including Maple Ridge in the distance. Beautiful view, Sarah commented, noting how the subdivision looked like an architectural model from this height. I designed this house specifically to observe my creation, Thornfield said, settling into a chair that looked more like sculpture than furniture. A good architect must maintain perspective on his work, your work being Maple Ridge. My work is the creation of ordered living spaces. Too many people today live in chaos, Detective. Random furniture placement, arbitrary daily routines, relationships based on emotion rather than compatibility. I design communities that encourage structure, purpose, meaning. Sarah opened her notebook. I understand you've been visiting residents, recently conducting surveys. Quality control is essential in any architectural project. I like to ensure that the people living in my spaces are adapting properly to the intended lifestyle. Something in his phrasing made Sarah's skin crawl. Adapting properly. Some people naturally embrace order, Detective. Others need guidance. I provide that guidance when necessary. What kind of guidance did you provide to Eleanor Hartwell and Harold Pemberton? Thornfield's expression didn't change, but Sarah noticed his hands tighten slightly on the arms of his chair. Such tragic losses. Both were exemplary residents, who truly understood my vision for community living. When did you last see them? I visited both of them recently, as part of my regular community maintenance rounds. Eleanor was having some difficulty maintaining her morning routine, and Harold had become distracted from his chess studies. I provided some suggestions for improvement. What kind of suggestions? Thornfield stood and walked to the window, his back to Sarah. From this angle, she could see Maple Ridge spread out below like a model train set. Detective, do you live alone? The question caught Sarah off guard. I'm sorry, living alone requires particular disciplines. Without the natural structure provided by family obligations, one must create artificial structures to prevent descent into chaos. Eleanor and Harold both needed reminding of this principle. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Mr. Thornfield, where were you yesterday morning between 8 and 10 a.m.? He turned back to her, that same unsettling smile in place. "I was here, detective, observing my community, as I am every morning. It's remarkable how much you can see from the proper vantage point." Sarah left Thornfield's house with more questions than answers, but also with a growing certainty that she was dealing with something far more complex than two coincidental deaths. The architect's references to community maintenance and proper adaptation suggested a level of control over residents that went beyond normal property management. Back at the station, she found Mike Rodriguez hunched over his computer, surrounded by printouts and case folders. "Please tell me you found something useful," Sarah said, settling at her desk with coffee that had gone cold hours ago. "More than useful, disturbing." Mike handed her a folder. "I went back 5 years and looked at death records for Maple Ridge residents. In a normal suburban community of 200 households, you'd expect maybe 3 to 4 deaths per year, mostly natural causes among elderly residents." Sarah opened the folder and felt her stomach drop. Jesus, Mike, 17 deaths in 5 years. All natural causes, all elderly residents living alone, all found in perfectly arranged circumstances. Mike pointed to the timeline he'd created. "And here's the pattern. They cluster around specific time periods, always 2 or 3 within a few days of each other, then nothing for months." Sarah studied the date. October 2019, 3 deaths. March 2020, 2 deaths. August 2021, 3 deaths. January 2022, 2 deaths. The pattern continued through to the present. "It's like he's working in cycles," Sarah murmured. "That's not the worst part. Look at this." Mike handed her another file. "I got the autopsy reports for the previous deaths. Every single one showed signs of what the medical examiner called unusual positioning of the body after death." Sarah, read through Dr. Wells' previous reports. The language was consistent. Bodies found in poses that seemed too deliberate, too composed for natural death. But in each case, the cause of death was clearly natural. Heart attacks or strokes, consistent with the victims' ages and health conditions. "Mike, what if we're looking at this wrong? What if he's not killing them directly?" "What do you mean?" Sarah walked to the whiteboard and began sketching connections between the victims. "What if he's creating conditions that cause natural deaths? Stress, fear, psychological pressure applied systematically until the victim's body simply gives out." Mike stared at the board. "That would be almost impossible to prove, but not impossible to investigate. We need to talk to current residents. Find out exactly what kind of guidance Thornfield has been providing." They spent the rest of the afternoon conducting interviews in Maple Ridge. What they discovered painted a picture of a community living under subtle but persistent surveillance and control. Mrs. Patricia Donovan, 76, lived at 1089 Cedar Street. She answered her door with nervous energy, glancing over Sarah's shoulder as if expecting someone else. "Mr. Thornfield visited me last week," she admitted reluctantly. "He said my evening routine was disrupting the community's natural rhythms. I usually watch television until 11, but he suggested I would be happier with a 9 o'clock bedtime. Did you feel pressured to follow his suggestion?" "Not pressured exactly, but..." Patricia twisted her hands. "He has a way of making you Feel like you're disappointing everyone if you don't follow his recommendations. And he knows things. What kind of things? Personal things. He knew I'd been having trouble sleeping, knew about my financial worries, knew I'd been thinking about moving closer to my daughter. Things I'd never told anyone. At 1203 Elm Drive, they spoke with Robert Chen, no relation to Sarah, despite the shared surname. Robert was 79 and had lived in Maple Ridge for 3 years. Thornfield came by 2 weeks ago, Robert said, inviting them into a living room that looked like a furniture showroom. Said he'd noticed I was falling behind on yard maintenance and home exterior appearance standards. Are there written standards for the community? Not exactly, but he makes it clear what's expected. He showed me photographs of my house from different angles, pointed out inconsistencies in my lawn care pattern, suggested my garbage can placement was creating visual discord for the neighbors. Sarah noticed Robert's hands shaking slightly as he spoke. How did that make you feel? Ashamed, I suppose. I've always prided myself on maintaining my property, but when he pointed out the flaws, they seemed so obvious. He offered to help me develop a more systematic approach to home maintenance. What kind of help? A schedule, very detailed. Times for lawn watering, specific products for cleaning, exact measurements for furniture placement. He said, following. His system would reduce my daily stress and improve my integration with the community. The interviews continued throughout the afternoon, each resident describing similar experiences. Thornfield's visits always began with observations about their routines, followed by detailed suggestions for improvement, and concluded with subtle implications that their neighbors were judging them for their failures to meet community standards. But it was their final interview that provided the most disturbing insight. Margaret Westfield, 82, lived at 1445 Birchwood Lane, just 3 houses down from where Eleanor Hartwell had died. He's been visiting me weekly for the past month, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Says I'm at a critical stage in my community integration process. What does that mean? He's created what he calls an optimization program for me. Very specific instructions about meal times, sleep schedules, social interactions, even how I should arrange my furniture. He checks my progress each visit. Sarah leaned forward. Margaret, how do you feel when he visits? The elderly woman's eyes filled with tears, terrified, absolutely terrified. But I can't stop following his instructions because he makes it clear that my neighbors are watching, judging, and reporting back to him about my compliance. Have you considered moving away? He says that would be abandoning my commitment to the community, that it would be selfish and disruptive. He explained that I signed not just a property deed when I moved here, but a social contract to maintain community standards. Mike and Sarah exchanged glances. Margaret, did Eleanor Hartwell or Harold Pemberton ever mention having similar experiences? Oh yes, we would talk sometimes. Eleanor was so stressed about her morning routine evaluations. Harold said he felt like he was being studied like a laboratory specimen. We all felt it, but we were afraid to complain because Thornfield said that negative attitudes were contagious and harmful to community well-being. Driving back to the station, Sarah felt pieces of a horrifying puzzle clicking into place. Mike, he's not just controlling their behavior, he's creating a state of chronic psychological stress that's killing them. The question is, can we prove it? Everything he's doing appears to be legal. Visiting residents, offering suggestions, even detailed lifestyle recommendations aren't crimes. But systematic psychological harassment is. We need to establish a pattern of behavior, That shows intent to cause harm. And we need to do it fast, Mike said, checking his watch. Because if he's working in cycles, and we just had 2 deaths this morning, there are probably more coming. Sarah thought about Margaret Westfield's terrified expression, about Patricia Donovan's nervous glances, about Robert Chen's shaking hands. Somewhere in Maple Ridge, elderly residents were following David Thornfield's detailed instructions, trying desperately to meet his standards, feeling the crushing weight of constant observation and judgment. How many of them would survive the next few days? That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment reviewing the case files, but she couldn't concentrate. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw David Thornfield's calculating smile and thought about Margaret Westfield's trembling hands. She'd worked homicide cases involving serial killers, but this felt different, more insidious. Thornfield wasn't using weapons or poison. He was using fear itself as a murder weapon. Her phone rang at 11:47 p.m. Mike's voice was tense. "Sarah, we just got a call. Another resident was found dead. Margaret Westfield." Sarah felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. "I'm on my way." The scene at 1445 Birchwood Lane was becoming sickeningly familiar. Margaret had been found in her bedroom, sitting in a chair positioned precisely in front of her dresser mirror, as if she'd been arranged for viewing. She wore a pale pink nightgown and matching slippers, her hair brushed and neat, her hands folded in her lap. Dr. Wells was already examining the body. Massive heart attack, most likely brought on by extreme stress. Her blood pressure medications were laid out on the dresser with mathematical precision, but she never took tonight's dose. Sarah studied the bedroom. Like the previous scenes, everything was arranged with obsessive perfection. The bed was made with hospital corners, despite the fact that Margaret had been preparing for sleep. Books on the nightstand were stacked by size. Even her jewelry box was positioned at an exact angle to the dresser's edge. "Who found her?" Sarah asked. "Neighbor across the street, Mrs. Ellis." She noticed Margaret's bedroom light was still on at 2 a.m., which was unusual. Margaret always went to bed at exactly 9:30 p.m. Sarah interviewed Mrs. Ellis, a woman in her 60s who seemed genuinely shaken by Margaret's death. "Margaret was so worried these past few weeks," Mrs. Ellis explained. "She would call me sometimes in the evening, almost in tears, about whether she'd followed her instructions correctly for the day." "What instructions?" "From Mr. Thornfield. He'd given her very specific guidelines about everything. When to eat, what to eat, how to arrange her furniture, even how long to spend on each daily activity. She had it all written down in a notebook." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Do you know where this notebook is?" They found Margaret's notebook in the kitchen, filled with pages of meticulous handwriting documenting Thornfield's instructions. Sarah photographed each page, reading entries that became increasingly desperate and detailed. "Monday, Mr. T visited. Says my breakfast routine is 3 minutes too long. Must reduce to exactly 12 minutes, including cleanup. Neighbors are noticing. The delay. Wednesday, failed morning inspection. Couch cushions were 2 degrees off center. Mr. T very disappointed. Says I'm not taking community integration seriously. Friday, Mr. T brought photos showing proper napkin folding technique. Must practice until I can achieve his standard. Says my table settings reflect poorly on the entire street." The entries continued for weeks, showing Margaret's increasing anxiety about meeting impossible standards, while Thornfield's visits became more frequent and his criticism more detailed. The final entry was dated the day before. "Margaret's death Mr. T says I'm approaching a decision point. Either I commit fully to community excellence, or I consider whether Maple Ridge is the right place for me. But he's made it clear that leaving would be selfish and harmful to my neighbors. I don't know what to do. I can't sleep. I can't eat. Can't stop worrying about disappointing everyone. Sarah closed the notebook, feeling sick. Mike, we need to get a warrant for Thornfield's house. This is evidence of systematic psychological torture. On what grounds? Visiting elderly residents and giving them lifestyle advice isn't illegal, but creating a campaign of harassment designed to cause fatal stress levels is. Look at this notebook, Mike. This is documentation of deliberate psychological manipulation with clear intent to cause harm. I'll call Judge Morrison in the morning, but Sarah, you know how difficult these psychological harassment cases are to prosecute. Defense lawyers will argue he was trying to help, that he had no way of knowing his suggestions would cause fatal stress. Sarah stared out at Maple Ridge, where porch lights created perfect patterns of illumination along the curved streets. Then we need to catch him in the act. We need evidence that shows he knows exactly what he's doing. What are you thinking? I'm thinking about all those elderly residents living alone, following his instructions, terrified of disappointing him. If he's working in cycles, and we just had 3 deaths in 2 days, the cycle might not be over. They spent the next morning reviewing Thornfield's pattern more carefully. The clusters of deaths typically occurred over 3 to 4 day periods, with an average of 4 victims per cycle. If the pattern held, 1 more elderly resident would die within the next 24 hours. Sarah convinced Captain Rodriguez to authorize surveillance of Thornfield's house and his movements throughout Maple Ridge. But she also had a more dangerous idea. Mike, what if we could get someone inside his system? Someone he'd want to control. What do you mean? Look at his victim profile. Elderly, living alone, routine-oriented, isolated from family. What if we could create a target he couldn't resist? Mike stared at her. Sarah, you're not thinking of using yourself as bait. Not me. I'm too young, too obviously connected to law enforcement. But what about my Aunt Helen? Sarah's Aunt Helen was 74, recently widowed, and currently staying in Sarah's guest room while deciding where to live permanently. More importantly, she'd been a drama teacher for 40 years and could play any role convincingly. Absolutely not, Mike said immediately. We are not putting a civilian at risk. She wouldn't be at risk. We'd have surveillance on her constantly, and she'd never be alone with him. We just need her to establish contact, get him talking, maybe. Get him to reveal his methods. And if something goes wrong, Sarah thought about Margaret Westfield's final notebook entry, about Eleanor Hartwell's arranged breakfast, about Harold Pemberton's interrupted chess game. Something is already going wrong, Mike. Right now, somewhere in Maple Ridge. Another elderly person is following Thornfield's instructions, probably having a heart attack or stroke from the stress. We can keep reacting to his murders, or we can get ahead of him. The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's phone. Dr. Wells' voice was grim. Detective Chen, I just finished the preliminary examination of Margaret Westfield's body. You need to know, she had bite marks on her lower lip, probably self-inflicted, and her fingernails showed signs of chronic stress-related picking. But more importantly, I found something in her bedroom that you missed. What? A small, digital recording device hidden behind her dresser mirror. It's been recording everything in that room for at least the past week. Sarah felt ice in her veins. Recording device. Voice activated. professionally installed. Someone has been monitoring Margaret Westfield's private activities, probably documenting her compliance with whatever instructions she'd been given. Dr. Wells, I need you to check the previous crime scenes immediately. Look for similar devices. Already. On it. I'll call you back within the hour. Sarah hung up and looked at Mike. He's not just giving them instructions. He's surveilling them to ensure compliance. This just became a full-scale stalking and harassment case. Sarah, if he's recording them, he might have recorded evidence of his own crimes. Audio of him threatening them, describing his methods, maybe even expressing satisfaction when they die. Which means we need to get to those recording devices before he realizes we know about them. Dr. Wells called back 43 minutes later, with confirmation that similar devices had been found at both Eleanor Hartwell's and Harold Pemberton's houses. 3 victims, 3 hidden surveillance systems, all professionally installed and all recording the final weeks of their lives. Dr. Wells, were you able to retrieve any of the recordings? That's the strange part. Detective devices were wiped clean, but not recently. They were cleared within hours of each death, which means someone had remote access to them. Sarah felt the pieces clicking together. He's not just watching them die, he's collecting audio recordings of their final days, their stress, their fear, their desperation to meet his standards. Jesus, Mike whispered. He's keeping trophies. More than trophies. He's documenting his methodology, probably for his own satisfaction, maybe even for improvement of his techniques. Sarah grabbed her jacket. We're going back to his house. Warrant or no warrant. If he's got recordings of 3 murders, that's evidence we can use. Sarah, slow down. We need to do this right, or anything we find will be inadmissible. Then we do it right. But we do it fast, because somewhere in Maple Ridge, his next victim is probably having a panic attack right now, wondering if they've positioned their breakfast dishes correctly. Judge Morrison issued the search warrant at 3:17 p.m., citing probable cause based on the hidden surveillance devices and documented pattern of psychological harassment. By 4 p.m., Sarah and Mike were driving up Mountain View Road, Tornfield's glass and steel house, followed by a forensics team and 2 backup units. The house looked even more imposing in the late afternoon light, its angular surfaces reflecting the sky in ways that made it difficult to see inside. Sarah wondered if that was intentional. Another aspect of Thornfield's need for control and observation while remaining hidden himself. They found Thornfield in his living room, sitting in the same sculptural chair as before, looking out over Maple Ridge as if he'd been expecting them. He showed no surprise when they displayed the warrant, simply nodded and stepped aside. I assume this is about Margaret Westfield's unfortunate passing, he said calmly. Such a tragedy. She was making excellent progress in her community integration. Sarah felt revulsion at his clinical tone. Mr. Thornfield, you're under investigation for stalking and harassment in connection with the deaths of 4 residents of Maple Ridge subdivision. I'm sorry, Detective, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. I provide community lifestyle consulting services. All of my interactions with residents are voluntary and focused on helping them achieve their full potential. Mike stepped forward. We found surveillance devices in the victims' homes, professional-grade recording equipment hidden in their private spaces. For the first time, Thornfield's composure cracked slightly. Sarah caught a flicker of something, surprise maybe, or calculation. I know nothing about any surveillance devices, he said, but his voice carried less conviction than before. The forensics team spread throughout the house while Sarah and Mike continued questioning Thornfield. His answers became increasingly evasive, but he maintained his story that he was simply helping residents improve their lifestyles. Then, Officer Janet Kim called from Thornfield's basement office. "Detective Chen, you need to see this immediately." The basement had been converted into what could only be described as a command center. 3 walls were covered with monitors showing live feeds from cameras positioned throughout Maple Ridge. Street views, front doors, several interior shots of houses. But it was the 4th wall that made Sarah's blood run cold. Detailed psychological profiles of every elderly resident living alone in the subdivision were displayed on a massive board. Photographs, personal information, health records, daily routine charts, family contact information, and what appeared to be stress tolerance assessments. Each profile was color-coded: green for compliant, yellow for in progress, and red for completed. Eleanor Hartwell's profile was marked red. Harold Pemberton's profile was marked red. Margaret Westfield's profile was marked red. And there was one more red profile that made Sarah's stomach drop. Robert Chen, the man they'd interviewed just yesterday. "Mike, call dispatch. We need units at Robert Chen's house immediately." But it was already too late. Mike's radio crackled with a report of another death at 1203 Elm Drive. Robert Chen had been found in his living room, slumped over a coffee table that held a perfectly arranged tea service he'd never had time to drink. Sarah turned to Thornfield, who was watching the monitors with what could only be described as professional interest, as if he were observing the results of an experiment. "You killed him," Sarah said, her voice barely controlled. "I've never killed anyone, Detective. I simply helped people achieve the structure they need to live meaningful lives. If their bodies can't handle the stress of self-improvement, that's unfortunate, but not my responsibility." Mike was examining the surveillance equipment. "Sarah, look at this. He's got audio recordings stored on these servers, organized by resident and date." Thornfield's expression shifted, revealing a flicker of pride despite his circumstances. "Documentation is essential for any serious research project." "Research project?" Sarah stepped closer to him. "Is that what you call it?" "I call it applied behavioral architecture, Detective. Most people live in chaos, making random decisions, following impulses, wasting their potential. I design systems that eliminate chaos and maximize human efficiency." Officer Kim had found another disturbing element: detailed journals documenting Thornfield's methodology and observations about each victim's psychological deterioration. "Detective, listen to this entry from 3 weeks ago," Kim read from a leather-bound notebook. "Subject 23, Margaret W., showing excellent stress response to increased frequency visits. Compliance with furniture positioning requirements now. At 98% accuracy. Sleep patterns disrupted as intended. Recommend advancing to Phase 3 of optimization protocol." Sarah felt sick. Phase 3. Thornfield smiled, that cold, calculating smile. "The final integration phase, Detective, when subjects fully commit to community excellence by eliminating all remaining chaotic elements from their lives." "You mean when they die from the stress you've inflicted on them?" "I mean when they achieve perfect order. Death is simply the ultimate expression of control over chaos." Mike discovered additional files on the computer servers, including detailed plans for expanding Thornfield's methods to other communities. "Sarah, he's been planning to develop similar subdivisions in 6 other states. This was just his pilot program. The scope of Thornfield's operation was staggering. He'd spent years developing his techniques, studying the psychology of elderly isolation, refining his methods for inducing fatal levels of stress while maintaining plausible deniability. "How many people have you killed?" Sarah demanded. "I've helped 17 residents achieve perfect integration with their community standards. Each one died peaceful, organized, properly arranged. Compare that to the chaos most people experience at death, detective, which is more humane." Sarah wanted to hit him, but instead she focused on the evidence surrounding them. "David Thornfield, you're under arrest for stalking, harassment, invasion of privacy, and conspiracy to commit murder. You'll never make those charges stick." "Detective, I never touched any of them. I never threatened them directly. I simply provided guidance for better living. We have surveillance devices you installed in their homes. We have recordings of your interactions with them. We have documentation of your systematic campaign to induce fatal stress levels. All you have is evidence that I cared about my community and tried to help residents improve their lives. Any reasonable jury will see that I was attempting to provide beneficial services." As they led Thornfield out of his house in handcuffs, Sarah looked back at the wall of monitors showing Maple Ridge from every angle. The subdivision looked peaceful in the evening light, but she knew that behind those perfect facades were terrified elderly residents, still following his instructions, still afraid to disappoint him, still unaware that their tormentor had been arrested. "Mike, we need to visit every elderly resident in that subdivision tonight. They need to know that Thornfield's been arrested, that they're safe, that they don't have to follow his instructions anymore. That's going to be a long night. Better a long night than more funerals." The interrogation room at Connecticut State Police headquarters felt cramped after the vast spaces of Thornfield's architectural laboratory. Sarah sat across from the man who had systematically terrorized an entire community, studying his calm demeanor as his lawyer whispered urgently in his ear. Attorney Marcus Webb was everything Sarah expected from a high-priced defense lawyer. Expensive suit, confident bearing, and an arsenal of legal technicalities designed to protect clients who could afford his services. "My client maintains his innocence of all charges," Webb began. "Mr. Thornfield is a respected architect who took a personal interest in the well-being of his community residents. Any suggestion that he intended harm is purely speculative." Sarah placed Margaret Westfield's notebook on the table. "This documents weeks of psychological pressure applied to an elderly woman who died of stress-induced heart failure. This documents a caring professional providing lifestyle guidance to someone who requested his help. She requested help arranging her napkins with mathematical precision." Webb glanced at Thornfield, who nodded slightly. "Mr. Thornfield's approach to community living emphasizes order and structure. Many residents found his guidance helpful in reducing daily stress and uncertainty." Sarah opened another folder. "What about the surveillance devices installed in their homes without their knowledge or consent?" For the first time, Webb looked uncomfortable. "My client maintains he had no knowledge of any surveillance equipment." "Then how do you explain the recording servers in his basement, organized by victim name and containing audio from the devices found in their bedrooms?" Thornfield leaned forward, speaking directly to Sarah despite his lawyer's restraining hand on his arm. "Detective, you don't understand what I was accomplishing. Those people were living in chaos, making random decisions, wasting their final years in meaningless routines. I gave them purpose, structure, a reason to strive for perfection. You gave them fatal levels of anxiety. I gave them the opportunity to transcend ordinary existence. Most people die in chaos, surrounded by clutter and confusion. My residents died in perfect order, having achieved something meaningful. Sarah felt the pieces of Thornfield's psychology clicking into place. This isn't about helping people. This is about your need to control them, to prove that you can make human beings conform to your vision of perfection. What's wrong with perfection, detective? What's wrong with eliminating chaos and waste from human existence? Nothing, until you start killing people to achieve it. Mike entered the room with additional evidence from the search. Sarah, we found architectural plans for 5 more subdivisions in different states, all designed with the same surveillance capabilities and population targeting systems. Webb tried to interrupt, but Thornfield was now fully engaged, his pride in his work overcoming his lawyer's advice. Those communities will be magnificent, detective. I've learned so much from the Maple Ridge pilot program. The next phase will be even more efficient, more systematic. I can reduce the stress to compliance timeline by at least 30%. David, Webb said sharply, stop talking. But Thornfield was beyond his lawyer's control now, finally able to share his vision with someone who might understand its scope. You know how much human potential is wasted every day by poor decision-making, detective. People spend hours choosing what to wear, what to eat, how to arrange their living spaces. I eliminate those decisions. I provide optimal solutions based on scientific principles of efficient living. Sarah realized that Thornfield genuinely believed he was performing a service. In his mind, the deaths were unfortunate side effects of a necessary improvement process. The people who died, David, did you feel anything when they died? I felt satisfaction that they had achieved perfect integration with their environments. Eleanor's final breakfast arrangement was flawless. Harold's chess position was mathematically elegant. Margaret's bedroom organization was a work of art. But they were terrified. They died in fear. They died having accomplished something meaningful. How many people can say that? Mike showed Sarah additional files they'd discovered. He's been documenting everything, Sarah. Every interaction, every stress response, every behavioral modification. He's treating human beings like laboratory subjects, because that's what they were, Thornfield said calmly. Subjects in the most important behavioral research project of our time. The systematic elimination of chaos from human existence. Webb was frantically scribbling notes, probably preparing an insanity defense, but Sarah could see that Thornfield wasn't insane in any legal sense. He was coldly rational, methodical, and completely convinced of the righteousness of his actions. David, what gave you the right to experiment on people without their consent? They consented when they moved to my community, detective. They agreed to maintain community standards. I simply helped them understand what those standards required. They agreed to live in a normal subdivision, not to be subjects in your behavioral modification experiments. Normal subdivisions are chaotic failures, detective. Random house designs, arbitrary property maintenance, residents making selfish decisions without considering community impact. I created something better. Sarah studied Thornfield's face, looking for any trace of empathy or remorse. She found none. He spoke about human beings the way an engineer might discuss building materials, focusing on their efficiency and utility rather than their humanity. The surveillance devices, David. Why did you need to record their private moments? Documentation is essential for scientific progress. I needed to verify compliance, measure stress responses, track behavioral modifications over time. How else could I refine my methods? You recorded their fear. You have audio of Margaret Westfield crying herself to sleep, of Harold Pemberton talking to himself about how afraid he was of disappointing you. I have audio documentation of the transformation process. Future researchers will study those recordings to understand how chaos reduction techniques can be optimized. Mike leaned across the table. There won't be any future researchers, Thornfield. You're going to prison for murder. I've committed no murders, Detective. I've simply created conditions that allow people to achieve their highest potential. If their bodies cannot handle the stress of self-improvement, that indicates pre-existing weaknesses, not criminal activity on my part. Sarah realized they were dealing with someone who had constructed an elaborate intellectual framework to justify systematic torture. In Thornfield's mind, he was a visionary architect of human behavior, not a killer. The next cycle, David. Who else were you planning to optimize? Thornfield glanced at his lawyer, then back at Sarah. Detective, there are 12 residents in Maple Ridge who are currently following preliminary optimization protocols. Without my guidance, they'll revert to chaotic behaviors that will make them miserable. Give me their names. I can't abandon my research subjects, Detective. They're depending on me for structure and purpose. Sarah stood up, feeling a mix of revulsion and urgency. Somewhere in Maple Ridge, 12 elderly people were still following Thornfield's instructions, still afraid of disappointing him, still unaware that their tormentor would never visit them again. David Thornfield, you're being charged with 4 counts of criminally negligent homicide, 12 counts of stalking, 17 counts of invasion of privacy, and conspiracy to commit murder. Your research project is over. As they led Thornfield back to his cell, he turned to Sarah one last time. Detective, you're making a mistake. Those people need structure. Without my guidance, they'll descend into chaos. You're condemning them to meaningless existence. Sarah watched him disappear down the corridor, still convinced that he was saving people rather than destroying them. The most dangerous killers, she realized, were often those who believed they were helping their victims. The emergency community meeting at Maple Ridge Clubhouse was unlike anything Sarah had ever witnessed. 43 elderly residents filled the room, many of them shaking, crying, or sitting in stunned silence as Sarah and Mike explained that David Thornfield had been arrested and that his community optimization program had been a systematic campaign of psychological torture designed to induce fatal stress levels. Martha Henderson, 81, raised a trembling hand. Detective, I've been following his instructions for 6 months. He told me my neighbors were judging me for my morning routine. Was that a lie? Yes, Martha. Your neighbors weren't judging you. Mr. Thornfield was manipulating you by creating artificial social pressure. But I felt so much better when I followed his schedule perfectly. I felt like I was finally doing things right. Sarah saw the heartbreaking complexity of Thornfield's psychological manipulation. He'd made his victims feel simultaneously inadequate and dependent on his guidance for improvement. Martha, you were already doing things right. There's no single correct way to live your life. Mr. Thornfield convinced you otherwise because he needed you to believe you were failing so you'd accept his control. Robert Wagner, 74, spoke from the back of the room. He told me I was selfish for wanting to visit my grandchildren because it disrupted my community commitments. I haven't seen them in 3 months. Mr. Wagner, visiting your grandchildren isn't selfish. It's normal and healthy. Mr. Thornfield isolated you from your support systems to make you more dependent on his approval. The questions continued for 2 hours. each one revealing another aspect of Thornfield's systematic destruction of his victims' confidence and autonomy. He'd convinced residents that normal human behaviors were character flaws, that their natural desires for social connection and personal choice were signs of weakness that needed correction. Dr. Patricia Wells addressed the group about the physical effects of chronic stress. Many of you have probably experienced symptoms like sleep disruption, appetite changes, heart palpitations, or digestive problems while following Mr. Thornfield's instructions. These were your bodies responding to sustained psychological pressure. "Are we going to be okay?" asked Patricia Donovan, the woman who'd told Sarah about her enforced bedtime schedule. "Yes, with time and support. But it's important to understand that recovery from psychological manipulation takes time. You may continue to feel anxious about breaking his rules, even though you know he can't hurt you anymore." Sarah had arranged for social workers and counselors to be present at the meeting. Recognizing that many residents would need professional help processing their experiences. But she was most concerned about the 12 residents Thornfield had identified as being in active optimization protocols. Among them was Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a retired college professor who'd been following Thornfield's instructions for 8 weeks. She sat in the front row, gripping a notebook filled with his detailed requirements for her daily routine. "Dr. Morrison, can you tell us about your experience with Mr. Thornfield's program?" Elizabeth's voice was barely audible. "He visited me twice a week, always with new observations about my failures to meet community standards. He'd noticed that I was reading until too late in the evening, that my kitchen cleaning routine was inefficient, that my clothes weren't organized properly in my closet. How did that make you feel?" "Ashamed, determined to do better, but also terrified that I would never be able to meet his expectations." Elizabeth opened her notebook. "I have 47 pages of instructions here, specific times for every activity, exact procedures for household tasks, even guidelines for how long I should spend on personal hygiene each morning." Sarah looked at the detailed handwriting, recognizing the same obsessive precision she'd seen in Margaret Westfield's final notes. "Elizabeth, did following these instructions reduce your stress?" "At first, yes. When I followed them perfectly, I felt accomplished. But the standards kept getting more detailed, more demanding. I stopped sleeping well because I was worried about making mistakes. I stopped eating regularly because meal preparation had become so complicated. I lost 12 pounds in 6 weeks." Mike stepped forward. "Dr. Morrison, you're a college professor. You've lived independently for decades. Did any part of you recognize that these demands were unreasonable?" Elizabeth looked surprised by the question. "He made it seem so logical, Detective. He'd show me photographs of my house from the street, point out inconsistencies that I'd never noticed. He'd explain how my failures affected property values and community cohesion. When he presented it that way, his requirements seemed not just reasonable but necessary." Sarah recognized the sophisticated nature of Thornfield's manipulation. He hadn't simply given orders. He'd constructed compelling logical frameworks that made his victims feel like willing participants in their own psychological destruction. "Elizabeth, what would have happened if you decided to stop following his instructions?" I asked him that once. He said it would be disappointing for the community, that other residents were counting on everyone to maintain standards. He implied that my neighbors would be forced to compensate for my failures, which wouldn't be fair to them. The meeting continued past 10 p.m., with residents sharing stories that revealed the full scope of Thornfield's psychological control system. He'd used shame, fear, social pressure, and artificial deadlines to keep elderly people in a constant state of anxiety about meeting impossible standards. But perhaps most disturbing was the realization that many residents had genuinely believed they were improving their lives by following his instructions. The temporary relief they felt when completing his tasks had created a psychological dependency that made them vulnerable to increasingly demanding requirements. As the meeting concluded, Sarah announced that all surveillance devices had been removed from the subdivision and that residents were free to live however they chose without fear of observation or judgment. "But what if we make mistakes?" asked Martha Henderson. "What if we go back to living the wrong way?" Sarah felt her heart break a little. "Martha, there is no wrong way to live your life as long as you're not hurting anyone. Your morning routine doesn't have to be perfect. Your house doesn't have to be arranged according to anyone else's standards. You get to decide what makes you happy and comfortable. But how will I know if I'm doing okay without someone to guide me? You'll know because you'll feel relaxed instead of anxious. You'll enjoy your daily activities instead of dreading them. You'll want to see friends and family instead of avoiding them." As residents slowly filed out of the clubhouse, many of them exchanged phone numbers and made plans to support each other through the recovery process. Sarah watched Dr. Morrison throw her notebook of instructions into a trash can, then immediately retrieve it, then throw it away again. Detective Elizabeth said, approaching Sarah, "I keep thinking I should save those instructions, just in case I need them later." "Is that normal?" "Yes, Dr. Morrison. It's completely normal. Mr. Thornfield trained you to believe you couldn't trust your own judgment. Rebuilding that trust takes time." Mike was coordinating with social services to ensure that all residents had access to counseling and support groups. "Sarah, the district attorney wants to meet with us tomorrow morning. Apparently, Thornfield's lawyer is already floating plea bargain options." Sarah looked out at Maple Ridge through the clubhouse windows. The subdivision still looked perfect in the moonlight, but now she knew the horror that had been hidden behind that perfection. No plea bargains, Mike. This man systematically tortured 17 people to death and was planning to expand his operation to other communities. He goes to trial and he gets convicted of murder. District Attorney Blackwell's closing argument methodically connected the evidence into an undeniable pattern of premeditated murder. "Ladies and gentlemen, David Thornfield didn't kill with guns or knives or poison. He was killed with fear. He was killed with shame. He killed with the systematic destruction of his victims' confidence in their own ability to live their lives. But make no mistake, he killed deliberately, methodically, and with full knowledge of what his actions would cause." Blackwell displayed photographs of the victims alongside excerpts from Thornfield's research files. Eleanor Hartwell died following breakfast routine requirements that had been designed to induce anxiety and compliance. Harold Pemberton died while following cognitive optimization protocols that Thornfield knew would cause overwhelming stress. Margaret Westfield died after weeks of escalating pressure designed to make her feel like she was constantly failing invisible standards. Robert Chen survived, but only because we arrested Thornfield before the optimization protocol could be completed. She played excerpts from the audio recordings, letting the jury hear Thornfield's voice reassuring victims that their feelings of dying were positive signs of progress. David Thornfield studied the physiological effects of psychological pressure on elderly populations. He documented optimal timelines for inducing cardiac stress. He refined his methods based on previous victims' responses. He expanded his operation to target vulnerable individuals systematically. This was not accidental. This was murder by psychological torture, planned and executed with scientific precision. Marcus Webb's closing argument focused on the complexity of proving intent in psychological manipulation cases. David Thornfield is guilty of harassment, stalking, and causing psychological distress through misguided attempts to help people improve their lives. But murder requires proof of specific intent to cause death, not just intent to modify behavior. The prosecution wants you to believe that my client's obsession with perfection constitutes murderous intent. But obsession and murder are not the same thing. Webb acknowledged the harm Thornfield had caused while arguing that it resulted from misguided helping rather than deliberate killing. My client believed he could help people live better lives through structure and organization. His methods were wrong, his approach was harmful, but his intent was to improve, not to kill. The tragic deaths resulted from his failure to understand the psychological impact of his techniques, not from a desire to cause death. But Webb's argument was undermined by Thornfield's own recorded words, telling victims that their distress was intentional and beneficial. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict on the charge of first-degree murder. In the death of Eleanor Hartwell, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Harold Pemberton, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Margaret Westfield, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Robert Chen, we find the defendant not guilty. Sarah felt a complex mix of satisfaction and sadness. Robert Chen had survived, so the murder charge hadn't applied. But Thornfield had been convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder plus multiple charges of stalking, harassment, and conspiracy. Judge Morrison sentenced Thornfield to life in prison without possibility of parole, plus an additional 50 years for the harassment and conspiracy charges. Mr. Thornfield, Judge Morrison said, "You systematically destroyed the lives of vulnerable elderly people who trusted you to help them improve their living situations. You used their natural desire for community acceptance as a weapon against them. You documented their suffering as if it was scientific research. You planned to expand your methods to other communities. The court finds your actions represent one of the most calculated and cruel forms of murder this jurisdiction has ever encountered." Thornfield showed no emotion as the sentence was pronounced. Even in defeat, he maintained the same cold, analytical demeanor that had characterized his entire approach to human interaction as he was led away in shackles. Thornfield turned back to the courtroom one final time. "Your Honor, those people died having achieved perfect order in their final moments. Compare that to the chaos most people experience at death, which is more humane." Judge Morrison's response was swift and sharp. "Mr. Thornfield, they died in terror, isolated from their families, convinced they were failures. There was nothing humane about what you did to them." 6 months after David Thornfield's conviction, Sarah returned to Maple Ridge Subdivision for a follow-up investigation. The FBI had discovered evidence of similar psychological manipulation campaigns in 3 other communities Thornfield had designed, resulting in additional charges and investigations that would likely continue for years. The subdivision looked different now. Residents had begun personalizing their properties in ways that would have horrified Thornfield. Lawn furniture appeared in random arrangements. House colors had been changed from the approved earth tones to brighter, more individual choices. Gardens grew in organic patterns rather than geometric precision, but the psychological scars remained visible in subtler ways. Sarah visited Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, who had moved back to her house after spending several months with her daughter, recovering from the trauma of Thornfield's optimization protocol. I still catch myself arranging things according to his instructions. Elizabeth admitted as they sat in her living room, which was now comfortably cluttered with books, family, photos, and personal mementos. Sometimes I wake up at night worried that I've positioned something incorrectly. Then I remember that there is no correct position. How are the other residents doing? Better, but slowly. We have a support group that meets weekly. It helps to talk to people who understand what it felt like to have someone systematically convince you that your natural way of living was wrong. Elizabeth showed Sarah a photo album she'd been working on, filled with pictures of residents engaging in activities. Thornfield would have disapproved of spontaneous neighborhood gatherings, children visiting grandparents, people working in their gardens at whatever times felt right to them. "We're learning to live chaotically again," Elizabeth said with a smile that seemed genuine for the first time since Sarah had met her. "It's harder than you might think. When someone has convinced you that your own judgment can't be trusted, rebuilding that confidence takes time." Sarah walked through the subdivision, noting the changes that marked the community's recovery from Thornfield's psychological control. The rigid perfection had been replaced by something more human, messier but more alive. At the community center, she found a memorial wall dedicated to Eleanor Hartwell, Harold Pemberton, Margaret Westfield, and Robert Chen, who had died of a heart attack 3 months after the trial. His system never fully recovering from the stress Thornfield had inflicted. Mike Rodriguez had been promoted to lead detective and was developing training programs to help law enforcement recognize psychological manipulation campaigns before they became fatal. "Sarah, we've identified at least 6 other cases nationwide where architects or community planners may have been using similar psychological control techniques. Thornfield wasn't unique. He was just more systematic than most. How do we prevent this from happening again?" Education, primarily. Teaching people to recognize when helpful guidance becomes controlling manipulation. And legal reforms to make psychological harassment campaigns easier to prosecute before they become fatal. Sarah thought about the complexity of Thornfield's crime. He'd used legitimate professional services, community improvement programs, and helping relationships as covers for systematic torture. The victims had participated willingly, at least initially, because they'd been convinced they were improving their lives. "Mike, what troubles me most is how easily he convinced intelligent, educated people that their natural way of living was wrong. These weren't people who were obviously vulnerable to manipulation, but they were isolated, living alone, dealing with the natural insecurities that come with aging. Thornfield exploited universal human desires for acceptance and improvement. That's what made him so dangerous." The final piece of Thornfield's story emerged 6 months later, when investigators discovered his personal journals dating back 15 years. The entries revealed that his techniques had been developed gradually, refined through experiments on previous communities that had been dismissed as coincidental clusters of natural deaths. Among elderly residents, Maple Ridge hadn't been his first experiment. It had been his masterpiece, the culmination of years of perfecting psychological murder techniques. The journals also revealed Thornfield's ultimate goal, the development of entire cities designed around behavioral control principles, where psychological manipulation would be built into the architecture itself, creating populations that were perfectly compliant, perfectly ordered, and ultimately perfectly controlled. Sarah read the final entry, written the night before his arrest. The Maple Ridge project has exceeded all expectations. 17 successful optimizations with minimal external suspicion. Subjects responded to psychological pressure protocols with remarkable consistency. The next phase will involve entire planned communities designed from the ground up for systematic behavioral modification. Within 10 years, I will have created the first truly ordered human populations in modern history. Chaos is the enemy of human happiness. I am simply helping evolution along. Sarah closed the journal, feeling grateful that Thornfield's vision would never be realized. But she also felt haunted by the knowledge that his techniques could be replicated, that other people with similar obsessions might study his methods and adapt them for their own purposes. The Maple Ridge murders had ended, but the shadow of David Thornfield's work would remain as a reminder of how easily the desire to help could be twisted into something monstrous, and how vulnerable human beings could be to those who understood their deepest fears and desires. In her final report on the case, Sarah wrote, "David Thornfield represents a new category of serial killer, one who uses psychological manipulation rather than physical violence to murder his victims. His techniques were sophisticated, his methods were systematic, and his understanding of human psychology was profound. The danger he represented was not just in the lives he took, but in the methodology he developed for taking them. Law enforcement agencies must be trained to recognize psychological manipulation campaigns before they become fatal. Communities must be educated about the difference between helpful guidance and controlling manipulation. And society must acknowledge that murder by psychological torture is still murder, regardless of how cleverly it's disguised as helping behavior. The residents of Maple Ridge are recovering, but slowly. The damage done by systematic psychological control extends far beyond the immediate victims. It affects entire communities, destroying trust, confidence, and the basic human right to live without fear of constant judgment. David Thornfield is in prison for life, but his legacy serves as a warning. The most dangerous predators are often those who convince us they're helping us become better people. As Sarah submitted her final report, she thought about Dr. Morrison's photo album, filled with images of people learning to live chaotically again. It was perhaps the most hopeful thing to emerge from the entire horrific case, the recognition that human misneezes, imperfection, and individual choice were not flaws to be corrected, but fundamental aspects of what made life worth living. The perfect order David Thornfield had tried to impose through terror would always be a hollow victory compared to the beautiful chaos of people choosing how to live their own lives. Karen Blackwell was known for taking on difficult cases, but she looked troubled as she reviewed the evidence against David Thornfield. Her office overlooked the courthouse square, where early morning joggers were beginning their daily routines. Blissfully unaware that their simple freedom to choose their own schedules was something that had been stolen from an entire community. "The evidence is compelling," Blackwell said, spreading crime scene photos across her desk, "but proving intent to commit murder is going to be challenging." Thornfield's defense will argue that he was providing lifestyle consulting services and had no way of knowing his suggestions would cause fatal stress levels. Sarah had been dreading this conversation. "Karen, we have surveillance devices, psychological profiles, documented patterns of escalating pressure designed to induce compliance through fear. How is that not evidence of intent?" "It's evidence of stalking and harassment, absolutely. But murder requires proof that he intended to cause death, not just psychological pressure." Mike placed additional files on the desk. "What about his journals?" He documented every step of his process, including observations about victims' deteriorating health and stress responses. Blackwell read through several entries, her expression growing more grim. These help, but look at the language he uses. He talks about optimization and community integration, not killing. A good defense attorney will argue that he genuinely believed he was helping people improve their lives. He called them research subjects, Sarah said. He documented their fear responses like a scientist studying laboratory animals, which supports stalking and harassment charges, but again, doesn't necessarily prove murderous intent. Blackwell closed the files. I'm not saying we shouldn't prosecute, but we need to be realistic about what we can prove beyond reasonable doubt. Sarah felt frustration building. So he gets away with murder because he was clever enough to use psychological manipulation instead of physical violence. He doesn't get away with anything. We charge him with what we can prove. Multiple counts of stalking, invasion of privacy, conspiracy to commit fraud, and criminally negligent homicide. With his pattern of behavior, he's looking at 25 to 30 years in prison. But not murder. Not unless we can find evidence that he explicitly intended to cause death, not just compliance. Mike had been quietly reviewing Thornfield's computer files. Karen, what if we focus on the expansion plans? He was preparing to replicate his methods in other communities. That suggests he knew his techniques were causing deaths and planned to continue causing deaths. Blackwell nodded slowly. That's a stronger argument. If we can show that he understood his methods were lethal and planned to continue using them, that supports a charge of conspiracy to commit murder. Sarah thought about the wall of profiles in Thornfield's basement, the color-coded system that marked victims as completed when they died. He kept trophies, the recordings of their final days, the photographs of their arranged bodies, the detailed documentation of their psychological deterioration. That's not the behavior of someone who accidentally caused deaths. Now you're thinking like a prosecutor, Blackwell said. We build a case that shows pattern, intent, and premeditation. We demonstrate that he knew his methods were killing people, and continued refining them for maximum psychological impact. The prosecution team spent the next 3 weeks analyzing every aspect of Thornfield's operation. What they discovered was even more disturbing than the original evidence had suggested. Thornfield's computer files contained detailed psychological research about stress-induced cardiac events in elderly populations. He'd studied the physiological effects of sustained anxiety, the relationship between social isolation and heart disease, and the optimal techniques for inducing fatal levels of psychological pressure. Most damning was a document labeled Optimization, Protocol Refinements, that contained his analysis of why some residents died quickly, while others required extended pressure campaigns. Listen to this, Mike read from the file. Subject compliance varies significantly based on pre-existing anxiety levels and social support systems. Subjects with strong family connections require more intensive isolation protocols before reaching optimal stress thresholds. Recommended modifications include scheduling conflicts with family visits and creating artificial emergencies that require cancellation of social activities. Sarah felt sick. He was deliberately destroying their relationships with their families to make them more vulnerable to his psychological manipulation. And here, Mike continued. Analysis of cardiac stress responses suggests that optimal mortality timeline is 6 to 8 weeks of sustained pressure, with twice-weekly compliance evaluations and daily surveillance monitoring. Subjects who die earlier may indicate excessive pressure application. while subjects who survive beyond 10 weeks require enhanced protocol intensity. Blackwell looked up from her notes. This is premeditated murder, systematically planned and executed. He wasn't helping anyone. He was conducting lethal human experiments. The breakthrough came when forensic specialists recovered deleted files from Thornfield's servers. Among them were audio recordings of his private conversations with residents. Conversations that revealed his true intentions. In one recording, Margaret Westfield could be heard crying as she told Thornfield she couldn't sleep because she was so worried about meeting his standards. Thornfield's response was chilling. Margaret, stress is simply your body's natural response to positive change. The fact that you're feeling pressure means the optimization process is working correctly. Most people resist improvement, but you're embracing it. That shows remarkable character strength. But I feel like I'm dying from worry, Margaret's voice said. You're not dying, Margaret. You're being reborn as the person you were always meant to be. Perfect integration with your environment requires the death of your old, chaotic self. That process is naturally uncomfortable, but the results will be magnificent. Sarah listened to the recording with horror. Thornfield had explicitly told Margaret that the stress was intentional, that it was part of a process designed to fundamentally change her, and that her feelings of dying were evidence that his methods were working. Karen, this is murder. He told her that feeling like she was dying was a good sign. He knew exactly what he was doing. Additional recordings revealed similar conversations with other victims. Thornfield consistently reinforced that their physical and emotional distress was evidence of positive change, that their fear and anxiety were necessary components of achieving perfect integration with their environment. In his final conversation with Harold Pemberton, recorded 3 days before Harold's death, Thornfield could be heard saying, "Harold, your chess game has improved remarkably since you've been following my cognitive optimization protocols. The fact that you're having difficulty concentrating on other activities simply means your mind is prioritizing correctly. Let the stress guide you toward perfect focus." Harold's voice was barely audible. "I can't eat, David. I can't sleep. I keep thinking about whether I've arranged everything correctly." That's your mind eliminating distractions, Harold. Most people waste mental energy on trivial decisions. You're learning to focus on what truly matters, achieving perfect order in your daily existence. The recordings provided clear evidence that Thornfield understood his victims were suffering severe psychological distress, and that he intentionally reinforced that distress as part of his methodology. "These recordings change everything," Blackwell said. "We're no longer looking at criminally negligent homicide. This is deliberate, premeditated murder accomplished through psychological torture." Sarah felt a grim satisfaction as the charges against Thornfield were upgraded to 4 counts of first-degree murder, with additional charges for the systematic stalking and harassment of the 12 surviving victims. But she also felt profound sadness for the people who had died believing they were disappointing their community, never knowing that the man they trusted to help them improve their lives was systematically destroying them for his own twisted satisfaction. "Karen, what's the maximum sentence he's facing now?" With the murder charges and the conspiracy charges related to his expansion plans, he's looking at life in prison without possibility of parole. Good. Because somewhere out there, other communities might be targeted by people like him. We need to send a message that using psychology as a murder weapon won't be tolerated. Marcus Webb had built his reputation defending wealthy clients in complex white-collar crime cases. But the Thornfield trial presented challenges unlike any he'd faced before. His client was clearly guilty of something, but Webb's job was to ensure that the something wasn't murder. The defense strategy emerged during pre-trial conferences. Paint David Thornfield as a misguided perfectionist whose genuine desire to help people had tragic unintended consequences. Acknowledge the stalking and harassment charges while arguing that murder required proof of specific intent to cause death. Your Honor, Webb argued during a pre-trial hearing, my client is an architect who became obsessed with creating perfect living environments. His methods were unorthodox and ultimately harmful. But there's a significant legal distinction between causing accidental death through misguided, helping behavior and committing premeditated murder. District Attorney Blackwell countered with, the audio recordings. Your Honor, the defendant explicitly told victims that their feelings of dying were positive signs. He studied stress-induced cardiac events in elderly populations. He documented optimal timelines for psychological pressure that would result in death. This was systematic murder disguised as community service. Judge Patricia Morrison, ironically sharing a name with one of Thornfield's intended victims, ruled that both the psychological manipulation evidence and the expansion planning evidence would be admissible at trial. Sarah spent her evenings preparing testimony, reviewing crime scene photographs, and trying to understand how someone could systematically destroy human beings while convincing himself he was helping them. The psychological complexity of the case troubled her more than straightforward murder investigations. Mike was handling media relations, which had become increasingly complex as news of the Maple Ridge murders spread nationally. The case had attracted attention from psychology researchers, architecture critics, and true crime enthusiasts, all fascinated by the intersection of design, psychology, and murder. Sarah, we've got reporters calling from 6 different states asking if there might be other Thornfield-designed communities with similar problems, Mike said. The FBI is starting preliminary investigations of architectural projects he consulted on over the past decade. How many potential sites are we talking about? At least 12 communities in 7 states where Thornfield provided design consultation or community planning services. Most of them have higher than average mortality rates among elderly residents. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the potential scope of Thornfield's activities. Mike, what if Maple Ridge wasn't his first experiment? What if he's been refining these techniques for years? The trial began on a grey Monday morning in February, with snow falling outside the courthouse windows. The jury selection had taken 3 days, with both sides rejecting potential jurors who seemed either too sympathetic to elderly victims or too skeptical of psychological manipulation as a murder weapon. District Attorney Blackwell's opening statement was precise and devastating. She walked the jury through Thornfield's systematic campaign of psychological torture, using his own words from the recovered audio recordings to demonstrate his awareness that his methods were causing potentially fatal levels of stress. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you will hear David Thornfield's voice telling Margaret Westfield that her feelings of dying were evidence that his optimization process was working correctly. You will hear him reassure Harold Pemberton that his inability to eat or sleep was simply his mind eliminating distractions. These are not the words of someone accidentally causing harm. These are the words of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and took satisfaction in his victim's suffering. Marcus Webb's opening was more complex, acknowledging his client's problematic behavior while arguing that misguided helping was not murder. David Thornfield is guilty of being obsessed with perfection to a degree that harmed the people he was trying to help. He is guilty of stalking and harassment. He is guilty of invading privacy and causing psychological distress. But he is not guilty of murder, because murder requires intent to kill, not intent to improve. Webb's strategy became clear as he questioned potential expert witnesses about the difficulty of predicting individual responses to psychological pressure. He argued that while Thornfield's methods were harmful, he couldn't have known they would be fatal to specific individuals. Sarah's testimony as the lead investigator lasted 2 full days. She walked the jury through the crime scenes, the surveillance evidence, the psychological profiles found in Thornfield's basement command center, but it was her description of the community meeting at Maple Ridge that seemed to affect the jury most deeply. These weren't just victims, Sarah explained. These were survivors of systematic psychological torture who had been convinced they were willing participants in their own destruction. Dr. Morrison showed me a notebook containing 47 pages of instructions that controlled every aspect of her daily life. She'd lost 12 pounds in 6 weeks because meal preparation had become so anxiety-inducing she'd stopped eating regularly. Webb's cross-examination focused on the distinction between harassment and murder. Detective Chen, did my client ever explicitly threaten to kill anyone? No, but he didn't need to. He created conditions that he knew would cause fatal stress levels. But detective, isn't it possible that he genuinely believed his methods would help people live better lives? Sarah looked directly at the jury. Mr. Webb, your client studied the physiological effects of sustained psychological pressure on elderly populations. He documented optimal timelines for inducing cardiac stress. He told Margaret Westfield that her feelings of dying were positive signs. He knew exactly what he was doing. The most powerful testimony came from Dr. Morrison, who described her 8 weeks under Thornfield's optimization protocol. He made me believe that my natural way of living was selfish and chaotic, she said, her voice steady but filled with residual trauma. He convinced me that my neighbors were judging me, that I was disappointing the community, that I needed his guidance to become the person I was supposed to be. Dr. Morrison Blackwell asked, "How did following his instructions make you feel?" Terrified, constantly terrified that I would make a mistake, that I would disappoint him, that I would fail to meet standards I didn't fully understand. I stopped sleeping. I stopped calling my children because he'd convinced me that my family relationships were disrupting my community integration. I felt like I was dying, but I believed that was necessary to become perfect. Webb's cross-examination was gentle but persistent. Dr. Morrison, did Mr. Thornfield ever say he wanted you to die? Not in those words, no. Did he ever threaten you with physical harm? No, but the psychological pressure was overwhelming. But isn't it possible that he genuinely believed his methods would improve your life? Dr. Morrison looked directly at Thornfield for the first time during her testimony. Mr. Webb, I was a college professor for 35 years. I taught psychology courses. I understand the difference between helpful guidance and systematic manipulation designed to destroy someone's sense of self. Your client wasn't trying to help me. He was conducting an experiment to see how much psychological pressure I could endure before my body gave out. The forensic evidence testimony lasted 3 days, with experts explaining the surveillance systems, the computer files, and the audio recordings. But the most damaging evidence was Thornfield's own research into stress-induced cardiac events and his documented refinements to his optimization protocols based on previous victims' responses. Dr. Patricia Wells testified about the autopsy findings. explaining how chronic psychological stress could trigger heart attacks and strokes in elderly individuals. The positioning of the bodies was also significant, Dr. Wells explained. In each case, the victim appeared to have been arranged post-mortem, in poses that reflected their compliance with Mr. Thornfield's instructions. Eleanor Hartwell was positioned as if she'd been following his breakfast routine requirements. Harold Pemberton was arranged at his chessboard in the exact posture Mr. Thornfield had specified for cognitive optimization activities. Dr. Wells, Blackwell asked, "In your expert opinion, what does this post-mortem positioning suggest?" "It suggests that someone was present at or shortly after the time of death. Someone who wanted to document that the victim had died while attempting to follow specific behavioral requirements." Webb objected to speculation about the positioning, but the damage was done. The jury could see that Thornfield hadn't just caused these deaths. He'd treated them as artistic achievements to be properly displayed. The prosecution's final witness was Dr. Robert Chen, Harold Pemberton's neighbor, who had survived Thornfield's optimization protocol and lived to describe its effects. He told me that stress was simply my body's natural response to positive change, Robert testified. When I said I was having chest pains and trouble breathing, he said that meant my cardiovascular system was adapting to more efficient living patterns. He convinced me that seeking medical attention would be giving in to chaos and weakness. Sarah watched the jury's faces as Robert described how Thornfield had systematically isolated him from his family and convinced him that his natural human relationships were obstacles to community integration. "I almost died," Robert said quietly, "not just physically, but psychologically. He had me convinced that everything I'd ever done naturally was wrong, that I couldn't trust my own judgment, that I needed his constant guidance to avoid disappointing everyone around me."